Reading this morning, and Micah Brown's going to read that for us, and it's Acts 16, verses 9 to 15, which will support our Sunday school lesson this morning, lesson 10, which is based around Jesus heals on the Sabbath. Thanks, Micah. Okay, so we've been enjoying a great series from Brother Roger Lewis this weekend, and he is going to continue that for our adult Sunday school class on why did Lydia constrain Paul? Brother Roger.
Well, good morning, everyone. On this fine and sunny Hunter Valley day. Now, in that reading that we had in Acts 16, we've got, of course, an introduction to Lydia, who's the woman of our story this morning. And the title is, Why Did Lydia Constrain Paul? And you'll notice that that phrase is referred to in Acts 16. Do you know, in every generation, there have been people who've had an extraordinary impact for good on the lives of others. And in every ecclesia, there are people who seem to be, shall we say, more influential in a good way of inspiring others, encouraging others in the things of the truth. And I think that Lydia was just such a person. There's a passage in the Gospels that says this: Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and the house was filled with the odor, the fragrance of the ointment. And I think that Lydia's example was like that. You see, she was so special in the exercise of the gifts that she had in the service of the truth that the ecclesial house that she belonged to was filled with the fragrance of her example. And just how true that was, we shall see by and by as our story unfolds. Now, every story has a beginning, and Lydia's story began in the highly unusual circumstances that brought her into contact with the Apostle Paul. We believe their meeting was providential. And it's right here in Acts 16. Just see how this was brought about. Acts 16, just going back to verse 6, it says, that tells you I'm a New Zealander, doesn't it? Go back to verse 6. And it says, Now when they had gone throughout Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden of the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. Now, the apostle's already in Galatia, and the province of Asia lies to the west of where he was, but the Holy Spirit said, no preaching permitted in that area, at least for the moment, not to the west. Well, the problem is they'd already preached to the east of where they were, so there's no point going east, and there's no point traveling south, because that simply led back into the waters of the Mediterranean. So if you couldn't go west or east or south, where would you go? Well, they said, well, verse 7 says, after they were come to Mysia, they essayed to go into Bithynia. That's due north, but the Spirit suffered them not. So now they couldn't go north either. So where were they to go? There was no point in going back, so forwards then, but forwards where? So do you know what they decided to do? They took a line between north and west and they ended up pretty well exactly in the middle between those two, and they got to Troas. That's exactly where Troas was. So they came down to Troas and they decided to wait there until there should be some indication from God as to where next they might go. And sure enough, something did happen, because verse 9 says, a vision appeared to Paul in the night, and there stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. You know, it's all how we read our Bibles. Good Bible study is based on good Bible reading. Now, shall I just read that verse to you again? Because I think this is perhaps how it should be read. Verse 9, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night, and there stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. And I think that's the emphasis, because it confirmed their thinking as to where their preaching efforts should next be centered. And clearly that's the way the Apostle Paul read it or understood the vision, because verse 10 says, does it not? And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel unto them. Oh, yes, that's exactly how the apostle read the meaning of the vision. And the apostle was very decisive in terms of his response. This was the answer he'd been waiting for. It was almost as if he couldn't wait to get there now that he knew what to do and where to go. So verse 11 says, therefore, loosing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, and the next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi. And I think that when you read those words carefully, how long do you think it took them to get there? I think 2 days. You agree with that? It says, verse 11, we came from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, that's the first day, and the next day to Neapolis, which, by the way, is the port city where you get off to walk into Philippi, and from thence to Philippi. That's the second day. They got there in 2 days. Now, do you know why that's interesting? Later on in Acts chapter 20 and verse 6, it says, and we sailed away from Philippi, which, by the way, would be Neapolis, the port. We sailed away after the days of unleavened bread and came unto them to Troas in 5 days. So traveling in the opposite direction, one of the sailing occasions that Paul was engaged in Acts 20, to make that same journey took 5 days, but this time it only took 2. It's almost as if the Spirit was blowing behind the boat to get that boat just as quick as it could through that water to Neapolis. All Paul was anxious to get to Philippi just as soon as he could. Of course, Philippi was the most important town in the region. And so Paul chose to go there first, and having got there, they no doubt spent a few days navigating the city, finding out where people congregated, finding out whether there was a Jewish presence in the city, and where they might begin their preaching work. There's always behind the scenes organisation, isn't there? And this place and this time was no exception. But that work of preparation yielded an important piece of information, because they found out where the Jewish woman congregated, where the Jewish woman assembled, because it quickly became obvious to them that there was no Jewish synagogue there. But although there wasn't a synagogue, verse 13 says, on the Sabbath we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. So he took the opportunity now to meet with these God-fearing women, and with good success. So now we're introduced to the heroine of our story. Verse 14 says, a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us. And you know, in that brief account of her life circumstances that Luke now gives, we actually learn quite a lot about her. She must have been a woman of considerable wealth, because she's a seller of purple. And the word purpuropolos actually means purple cloth. The New English Bible says she was a dealer in purple fabric. Our reader said she's a dealer in purple goods. And that fabric, incidentally, was made up into garments for the wealthy. And she would have needed significant money to transport, store, and sell such purple cloth. She came, says the record, from Thyatira. And that's interesting, because it just so happened that in Thyatira there was a guild for those involved in the dye trade. And she had access through that guild to purple dye, which was extremely expensive. She was a member of the guild. She probably owned a house in Thyatira. But we're told here in this chapter that she also has a large property in Philippi. Large? Yes, because she had a whole household of servants to help her. And they're probably also involved in the running of her business operations. So Lydia is a businesswoman of considerable acumen and substance. Now, do you know she could have thought this way, don't you think? She could have thought, how do I feel about association with this man, Paul? I've got a lot of money tied up in my business. There's a lot at stake here. I need to be very careful about the degree of contact that I might have with the apostle. If I'm too open about my association with the truth, it could be detrimental to my market dealings with people of high status who buy from me. I need to be cautious here. And yet when the Sabbath comes, where's Lydia? She's there at the place of prayer, and she's openly prepared to avow her connection to the apostle by offering him to lodge him and his company. Well, I think there's a good lesson here, see. Lydia did not allow her business activities to interfere with her commitment to the truth. The truth came first in Lydia's life. That was a good spirit, wasn't it? Truth came first. Didn't override business matters. And verse 14 wonderfully goes on to say, whose heart the Lord opened that she attended unto the things which were spoken of. You see, it doesn't matter, brothers and sisters and young people, it doesn't matter how wealthy we are or how important we think we are. God calls us, not the other way round. Sometimes we think we've found the truth and we've chosen God. No, you haven't. He's chosen us. And God calls those whom he will. That's his sovereign choice to so call. And we're told here that Christ opened her heart. And I think that this meeting was clearly providential, as later events would show, that the Lord had been at work in the life of this woman, so that this contact with this man came at just the right moment in her life. Have you ever had a moment like that in your life? Where the right connection came with the right person or the right words at just that right moment. Brother Robert says, in Ways of Providence, it's not till later on we look back in time, we think, you know what, that bit back there, that was providential. I see it now. That was providential, that moment in my life. Well, this was a providential moment in Lydia's life. She came into contact with Paul, and it absolutely turned her life around. So you see what she says, Acts 16, verse 15. And when she was baptized in her household, let's just stop there. Did you notice that? When she was baptized and her household. See, doesn't that remind us of Abraham, who circumcised all the men of his household on the self-same day that he was circumcised? And part of God's commendation of Abraham, the patriarch, were these words in Genesis 18, verse 19. For I know him, that he will command his household after him, and they shall keep the way of Yahweh. Abraham, well, he just enthused his household into that commitment to divine things. Lydia had a similar spirit to Abraham, and that resulted in her whole household being caught up in this joyful association with the truth. You ever met a person like that who just bubbles up, and you can't help but be influenced by them? That's what she was like. And then do you see what she goes on to say? When she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. Now, just think about this. Here's a woman with tremendous ability, tremendous resources, and yet she has a tremendous spirit of humility. There was nothing forward in the promotion of herself, nothing presumptuous about Lydia. If ye have found me to be faithful, she says. She might have been a capable woman, but her disposition in the first instance was deferential. Nothing presumptuous about Lydia. But do you notice that there was a development in her offer of hospitality? There's two little words here in this verse that we need to pick out and notice, pay attention to. You see, halfway through the verse, it says, she besought us. And then at the end of the verse, it says, she constrained us. Now, do you know those two words in the Greek are very, very different in their meaning? The first one, besought, parakaleo, means, well, can you tell me what parakaleo means? Entreat is good. To call near, I think, is the primary meaning of parakaleo, to call alongside, to call near. She called us near. Now, that's quite a soft word, isn't it? Quite a gentle word. She besought us. But the second word, constrained, is the Greek word parabiatsomai, which means to force contrary to nature. Oh, that's not a gentle word, not at all. So the first word's very gentle, she begged them. The second word's very urgent, she compelled them. Whew. Now, why that change? Well, I think we need to imagine the scene, you see. So Lydia said, if ye've judged me to be faithful, come into my house and abide there. And Paul perhaps said, look, that's very kind of you, Lydia, but we've got a policy of arranging our own accommodation in each city where we preach. And Lydia said, no, I've got plenty of room. It would be such a pleasure to host you so that you can focus on the preaching work. I've already had such benefit from what you've said. Do come and stay. And Paul said, well, look, thanks very much for the offer, but it's no trouble for us to make our own arrangements. In fact, Timothy's in town right now, just having a look at some possible lodgings. Lydia said, you're staying at my place, and that's all there is to it. There's 2 rooms down the corridor, there's towels on the bed, and dinner's at 6 o'clock. And Luke, who's writing up the story later on, speaks with awe at the manner in which somehow Lydia swept them all into her house, including the apostle, and blessed them with her hospitality. She constrained us, says Luke, writing this up later in the Acts of the Apostles. But that word constrained takes us all the way back to an Old Testament story, you see. I think it's a Spirit-inspired allusion. Come back to the 2nd of Kings, chapter 4, because I think this is where the word comes from when Luke says she constrained them. Because in the 2nd of Kings 4, and some of you will know before you even turned it up, that actually 2nd of Kings 4, that's the story of another great woman in Old Testament times, perhaps as influential and significant as Lydia was in her day. And we're told this in the 2nd of Kings chapter 4. This is an occasion when Elisha, the man of God, is busy in the work of the truth, just as the apostle was on the day he met Lydia. And we're told this, 2 Kings 4, verse 9, the record says that this woman said to her husband, verse 9, behold now, I perceive that this is an holy man of God, which passeth by us continually. Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on the wall, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a lampstand, and it shall be when he cometh to us that he shall turn in thither. She was building a little tabernacle for him, for Elisha, on the rooftop of her house, and she sought to fulfill his every need, including the provision of meals. And with what spirit did this woman, this great woman of Shunem, offer her hospitality? Verse 8. It fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, where was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread. See that word constrained in the Hebrew? Chuzak. It means to prevail, to take hold of, to seize. To seize. She laid hold on him. I think that's the very spirit of Lydia, don't you think? See, both women saw a man of God on the Lord's business, and both women had the perception to see the man's need and had a willingness to help. That's the very essence of hospitality. I can just imagine the great woman of Shunem saying to Elisha, you're staying at my place, and that's all there is to it. Now, what a delightful divine echo that binds these 2 remarkable women together in the holy record. The great woman of Shunem who constrained Elisha to eat bread with them, and Lydia who constrained the apostle. In fact, if you come back, but on the way back to Acts 16, come to Luke chapter 10, because that offer of hospitality that Lydia gave to the apostle was actually consistent with the advice that Christ had given to the 70 who were sent out incidentally to preach to the Gentiles. The 70 of Luke 11, sent out to preach to the Gentiles. Sorry, Luke chapter 10. You notice that it says in verse 5, the Lord said to his men, into whatsoever house ye enter, first say, peace be to this house. And if the Son of Peace be there, your peace shall rest upon it. And if not, it shall turn to you again. And in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the labourer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house. And into whatsoever city ye enter, and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you. You see that word remain there? In the same house remain, that word meno means to continue. They were to stay in the same place. If they were offered hospitality, he says, you stay right there, says the Lord. But that word, coming back to Acts 16, that's the very word that Lydia uses in her conversation with the Apostle Paul. Because she says in Acts 16, verse 15, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And that's the same word translated remain in Luke chapter 10 and the Lord's advice to his men. Remain in the same house. Lydia says, come into my house and remain there. And incidentally, the apostle did, of course, and inevitably when the apostle stayed in a house, it tended to become the place where that ecclesia would subsequently meet in that city. You might remember these words in the 1st of Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19. Aquila and Priscilla salute you much in the Lord with the ecclesia that is in their house. When Paul stayed with someone, remained with someone that tended to become the centre of the truth in that place. Now, I don't know what you think about that little story in Acts 16, but I find that a tremendous cameo of just what Lydia must have been like. And I think that as far as we can ascertain from Scripture, Lydia was the only woman whom the apostle allowed to help him in that way. It was no accident that this woman became the foundation member of the Ecclesia at Philippi. And I think that the record of her conversion is written up here in the record because she imbued her whole ecclesia with the fragrant spirit of her kindness, because Philippi became famous for its giving. And Philippi became famous as an ecclesia for its giving because Lydia was filled with that spirit of gracious generosity and care to an extent that Paul probably never experienced with any other sister. Now, how can we be so sure? Mere assertion. Let's have some scriptural evidence that Lydia had so affected the members of her ecclesia. Where did he go? Where did the apostle go once he left Philippi? Well, we know from Acts 17, verse 1, that he went to Thessalonica. And while he was there, he had a policy of providing for his own needs. If you come to the 1st of Thessalonians, we're told this. He arrived, having left Philippi, where Lydia was. He comes to Thessalonica. And it says this in the first epistle of Thessalonians, chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. He says, 1st of Thessalonians 2, verse 8, so being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but our own souls, because you are dear unto us. For ye remember, brethren, our labour and travail, for labouring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. He came to Thessalonica, he preached there, but he said, I wouldn't take money from you. I wouldn't be chargeable to you. That was his policy. And again, in the 2nd of Thessalonians, we're told the same. He repeats it. 2nd of Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 7. He says, ye yourselves know how ye ought to follow us, for we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you, neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labour and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an ensample unto you to follow us. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. So Paul loved this ecclesia. He loved the Thessalonians, but he wouldn't compromise his message of the fact that one needed to work for oneself. See, you know what the problem was in Thessalonica? There were busybodies, says the apostle, who weren't working at all. And in the context of exhorting them that they should work diligently for their living, Paul felt obliged to look after his own upkeep. We would not be chargeable unto any of you, was his word to them. He could hardly ask for help when he's telling them to get out and get work for your daily bread. But you see, what Acts and Thessalonians don't tell us is that while he was right here in Thessalonica, another ecclesia did send gifts to him to support him in his word. Because if you come back to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, we're told this. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 16. He says, for even in Thessalonica, ye, the Philippians, sent once and again unto my necessity. And that word necessity means need. The apostle needed the support, but he didn't want to take it from the ecclesia at Thessalonica. So while he was there telling the Thessalonians that they needed to get working, a gift arrived from another ecclesia, Philippi. But he wouldn't take it from Thessalonica, but he did take it from a woman in Philippi who thought about the needs of the apostle even when he'd left their ecclesia. And I think Lydia organised that beneficence. And so what he felt he couldn't accept from Thessalonica, he gladly received from Philippi because he trusted that their generosity would never be turned against him. Now, do you know how far that distance is? From Thessalonica to Philippi is about 190 kilometres. If you walk there at a brisk pace, it would take a courier about 6 days to reach Thessalonica and 6 days to go back to Philippi. And someone from the Ecclesia at Philippi did that twice for the apostle. Who do you think was the guiding spirit behind those gifts from Philippi? I suggest to you that the couriers were members from the household of Lydia who were baptized brothers now, and she's the instigator of those parcels of hospitality from afar. And the ecclesia at Philippi was the only ecclesia that Paul would accept them from. Oh, he was thankful for Lydia. Now, where did he go after that? He left Thessalonica, he travelled through Berea, he went down to Athens, and he finally went to Corinth. Now, let's have a look and see what happens when he got to Corinth. In the 2nd of Corinthians, we're told this in 2nd Corinthians chapter 11. So now he's preaching the truth in Corinth. He's a long way away from Philippi. We're told this in 2nd of Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9. And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied, and in all things I've kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. See that word wanted, when I was present with you and wanted, it's a word that in the Greek means to be deficient. It's translated destitute in Hebrews 11, verse 37. When I was destitute, says the apostle, he was financially impoverished at the time that he was in Corinth, but he couldn't accept help from the Corinthian ecclesia where he was preaching. Why not? Well, and some of you will know the background of the 2nd of Corinthians. He'd started the collections for the Jerusalem Poor Fund. It was one of the most noble and honourable things that the apostle did, the gathering of money for the Jerusalem Poor Fund from the Gentile ecclesias. And that collection had already begun, but the Judaizers had arrived and they'd reached Achaia, where the ecclesia of Corinth was, and they wasted no time in suggesting to the brothers and sisters of the meeting there that Paul had ulterior motives for gathering that money, supposedly for the poor saints at Jerusalem. Oh no, their suggestion was that he was probably dipping his hand in the till, that the apostle had access to the bag, that he was embezzling money from the fund. It was the most absolutely disgraceful rumour, completely wrong, false accusations, and it must have almost broken the apostle's heart because nothing could be further from the truth. His motives, his intentions were totally honourable in this matter. He would never have dreamed of taking money from those collections. So when he's here in Corinth, and that's been suggested about him, how could he possibly accept financial help from the Corinthian ecclesia under such circumstances? He just couldn't. And at that moment, when he's financially destitute, the verse says, that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. That word supplied is a lovely word. It means to completely fill up, to fill up what's lacking until the need is fully met. The apostle must have been so thankful for his help from this help from Macedonia, which arrived at just the right moment to alleviate his desperate need. But guess what? It wasn't all the ecclesias of Macedonia that sent funds to Paul and Corinth. In fact, this gift came from only one ecclesia in Macedonia. The one ecclesia that Paul felt he could accept that gift from came from Philippi. Now, how do we know that? Well, if you come back to Philippians again, Philippians chapter 4, we read these words. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15 says, Now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no ecclesia communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. And that word communicated there, koinoneo, means, of course, to fellowship, to share. No ecclesia fellowship with my need, but ye only. So when he was in desperate need in Corinth and that bundle of joy arrived, I think we can see the hand of Lydia in that package, sent all the way from Philippi to Corinth. And if ever there was a gift that arrived in the nick of time, it was this one. The apostle must have wept tears of relief and offered a prayer of thanks for those from Philippi who fellowshiped with his labors for the far. This was the third time that Philippi had so generously helped him. Well, it was going to be a fourth example of the Philippians' wonderful spirit of giving, because if you come back to the 2nd of Corinthians chapter 8, when the apostle wrote about the Jerusalem Poor Fund, he singled out the Macedonians as an example of just how wonderfully generous they had been in contributing to that fund. 2nd of Corinthians chapter 8 says, and reading from verse 1, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the ecclesias of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Can you see the paradox? Out of their deep poverty abounded the riches of their liberality. Do you know what we're being told? Philippi had no money to give, but they found it anyway. Philippi itself was in the grip of trouble, but they found money to actually contribute to that Jerusalem Poor Fund. How did they do it? Well, verse 3 says, for to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power, they were willing of themselves, and I'm going to read now from the Revised Standard Version, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. Begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And verse 5 says, and this they did, not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God. So how did they have such a tremendous spirit of giving? Because they gave themselves to God first, it says. And then as a result, they gave themselves to the work of the truth of God. Who? The Macedonian Ecclesia. That was the spirit of the Macedonian ecclesias. And that was the spirit of commitment in Philippi. But where did the Ecclesia of Philippi learn that spirit from? They learned it from Lydia. It was she that inspired the Ecclesia to a standard of giving in the work of the truth. It was unparalleled. A cup of cold water in the name of a disciple, for which I thank you. And you know, when the apostle finally sailed to Jerusalem with the proceeds of that collection for the Jerusalem Poor Fund, there were twice as many delegates from Macedonia as there were from any other region. And all the ecclesias in Macedonia, we already know that Philippi was the most generous. And now we come to the actual moment that brought forth the epistle of the Philippians. Come to Philippians chapter 4 again. And just notice now that this was the circumstance that produced the letter in the first place that Paul is writing to them about at this moment of time, and writes to them with such warmth and affection. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 10 says this, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful but lacked opportunity. See, by the time Paul wrote this letter, he was actually languishing in a prison in Rome. He was exhausted in body and he was probably depressed in mind. And a gift came. A gift came from the one ecclesia that would always send Paul gifts. I don't know that we can appreciate just what a tremendous boost this gift must have brought to his spirits, because it came to him with love from Lydia and from their whole ecclesia. And it came all the way from Philippi to Rome. And it found its way into his prison dungeon. He says, your care of me hath flourished flourished again. See that word flourished? It's used of fresh flowers that bloom in the spring. Your care has blossomed like spring flowers. Not by the way that they'd ever stopped caring, but you see, up until now, there'd been no opportunity to get a parcel through to him during his imprisonment in Rome. But now they had. And it came at a cost. He says, "You've well done," verse 14, "that ye did fellowship," there it is again, fellowship with my affliction. The Revised Standard Version says, "It was kind of you to share my trouble." So how did the Ecclesia of Philippi share his trouble? How did they fellowship his difficulty? Well, they sent him a gift. Yet again, they sent him a gift. Must have taken a great deal of courage and determination to get there. And they did manage it, because verse 18 says, "But I have all and abound, and I'm full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor, a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable and well-pleasing to God." So Epaphroditus, at great risk to his own life, managed to meet with the apostle in prison and deliver that package from the Ecclesia that showed him that they still loved him and remembered him. See that word odor in verse 18? That's the same word about the fragrance which filled the house in John chapter 12, verse 3. Paul smelled the fragrance of Lydia's care in his dungeon. But the perfume of Lydia's example filled the entire ecclesial house at Philippi. So this is the 5th time that the Ecclesia of Philippi had been at the forefront of giving generously for the work of the truth. And that spirit of overflowing gracious generosity came from the founding member of the Ecclesia. There was never a meeting as generous as this one. And I think that the apostle gives us 2 clues in this epistle that tell us that he saw Lydia's spirit as the key to the generosity of the meeting. Now, come back to chapter 1 and just read these words afresh. You will have already read them before, but, well, let's just see what he says. Philippians chapter 1, verse 3. Read them now in the context of Lydia. "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making request with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now." Now, how did the apostle experience their fellowship, their koinonia, their sharing in the gospel from the very first day? Who was the first conversion in Philippi who, having been converted, said, "If you've judged me to be faithful, come into my house and abide there"? I thank God for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day, says the apostle. That's Lydia. Isn't that Lydia? From the first day he got there. I thank God for that, says Paul. Now see what he says at the end of the epistle, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. "Now ye Philippians know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no ecclesia fellowshipped with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only." The beginning of the gospel. Where? In Philippi. Ye Philippians know. Now, what was the beginning of the gospel in Philippi? And the answer is the conversion of Lydia, followed by the baptism of all her household. So these words at the opening and close of the epistle, I think this is Paul's salute to Lydia, because he'd never forgotten her hospitality. "I thank God for your fellowship from the first day," he says. "Thank you, Lydia," he writes in this letter. So here's our question. Why did Lydia constrain Paul? I suggest to you, brothers and sisters, she couldn't help herself. She was, to quote the apostle's own words, she distributed to the necessity of the saints and was given to hospitality. And that word "given" in Romans 8 and Romans chapter 12, when Paul says that we ought to be given to hospitality, is a very strange word in the Greek. It means to eagerly chase after so as to pursue. In fact, it's such a strong word that I wonder whether he had Lydia in mind. Be so eager to chase down and pursue the opportunity of hospitality to others. I think he had her in mind. She was a wonderful woman, don't you think? And she inspired her whole ecclesia. She wasn't on the platform speaking, but she was absolutely inspiring people by the loveliness of her example. Now, let's come back to Acts 16 and see how the story of Lydia really opens and closes. Acts 16 says, and reading verse 15 again, just to get our bearings, Acts 16 verse 15 said, and when she was baptized and her household, she besought us, saying, if you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and abide there. And she constrained us. And so, of course, we know that the story starts with this joining of the apostle into Lydia's home. And now see how the story ends, Acts 16, verse 40. When Paul comes out of prison, he's asked to leave the city, verse 39. But before he did that, verse 40 says, they went out of the prison and entered into the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. So this story opens with Lydia inviting the apostle and his company to stay at her house while they preach the gospel. But by the time the story closes, the whole Ecclesia is meeting where? Why? Surprise, surprise. In Lydia's house. Why did Paul and Silas go to Lydia's house? Because that's where the brethren were. And her house is obviously commodious. She's got a whole retinue of servants, and it's now the place where the ecclesial meetings were being held. Such was the spirit of this woman, the spirit of gracious hospitality and of generous giving. And her spirit permeated the ecclesia of Philippi with its fragrance. You stop and ask yourself this question: why did Paul continue to accept gifts from this ecclesia when he would never accept them from anybody else? Why was he prepared to do that? Well, because he knew that the ecclesia that met in Lydia's house had given their gifts to him for the right reasons. They gave to him in a spirit of genuine care. They knew that they would never use it against him. They would never make him feel that he was in debt or under some obligation to them. They were the only ecclesia where he felt it was safe to receive their gifts, because he knew they were given with the best of motives and with the purest of hearts. So from this ecclesia and from none other would the apostle accept such presents in the course of his journeyings. He felt safe to take them. Now, we don't need purple cloth or large houses to show the same attitude of giving that Lydia showed so well. Her example lay in a spirit of care for others, showing perception for those who are in need, being willing to assist, reaching out with her hands to help. There are some people that are good at that. They see the need in others. See, Lydia knew that love is a verb. It's about what you do, not what you say. It's the spirit of generosity that asks for nothing back and expects nothing in return for gifts which have been freely given. So here was a sister who greatly influenced her own ecclesia for good, and she also gladdened the apostles' heart. We remember, of course, that there was a special house, was there not, in Bethany, where Christ felt safe to visit, a place that brought him comfort? Well, it seems there was a little house in Philippi where Paul felt he could visit and always felt like he'd come home. Lydia's house. Now listen to these words from a hymn and see if you can feel the spirit of Lydia in these words. I ask thee for a thoughtful love, through constant watching wise, to meet the glad with joyful smiles and wipe the weeping eyes. A heart at leisure from itself to soothe and sympathize. Wherever in the world I am, in whatsoever estate, I have a fellowship with hearts to keep and cultivate, a work of lowly love to do for him whom I wait.